The Cetrarch Compact did not conquer Earth. They did not need to. 11 days after their first vessel entered the heliopause, they only needed us to sign something. The document arrived not as a threat but as a courtesy, translated, notarized, and delivered by a diplomat who smiled the entire time he explained what we were giving up. Humanity had lost no cities. Humanity had lost no fleets because humanity had barely had one to lose. What humanity was about to lose was everything that happened after the signature, and almost nobody in the room reading it understood that yet. 3 days earlier, 4 compact cruisers had taken up position past the orbit of Neptune and disabled, without firing a single shot, every deep space relay humanity had built in 40 years of trying to listen for something like them. It was not a battle. The Compact does not consider it courteous to call something a battle when the other side never had a chance to fight back. Compact doctrine, translated loosely, calls this kind of encounter a clarification of relative capability. Humanity called it, in the emergency session of the Joint Earth Council convened 6 hours later, the worst week in the history of the species. The document the Compact delivered was titled in their own script, something that rendered in English as Instrument of Cessation, Third Category, Client Class Party. The Council's own translators, working off the Compact-provided English text, called it the Cessation Accord. Within 48 hours, every person on Earth with an internet connection was calling it the surrender document, because that was what it plainly was. It required Earth to disable 70% of its orbital defense capacity within 90 days. It required Earth to grant the Compact custodial access to designated systems in the outer solar system, a phrase nobody on the Council thought worth arguing about, because custodial sounded administrative and administrative sounded survivable. It required Earth to accept a permanent Compact legation with diplomatic immunity and unrestricted travel rights anywhere on the planet. In exchange, Earth received a formal guarantee that the Compact would not conduct what the document called further clarification actions for a period of no less than 1 standard Compact century, which worked out to roughly 81 Earth years, a number that struck most of the negotiating team as generous, because none of them had thought to ask what happened at the end of it. The diplomat who delivered the document called himself Ambassador Magistrate Soin Adryketh, and he did not look like anything humanity had imagined when it imagined first contact. He was tall in the way a lamppost is tall, silver-skinned, dressed in a robe of deep unadorned gray that the Compact apparently reserved for occasions of what he called asymmetrical formality. And he spoke English with the polished, faintly amused precision of someone who had learned it from watching 4 decades of human television purely, so that he would never have to hear a human mispronounce a Compact word. When he set the physical copy of the document on the table in the Council chamber, the Compact insisted on a physical copy, on Compact manufactured paper analog. For reasons nobody bothered to ask about, he did it gently, the way a person sets down something breakable that they do not actually believe is valuable. "We understand this is a difficult moment for your species," he said, and he was smiling when he said it. The specific smile of someone who has delivered this exact sentence to 11 other species before this one and expects to deliver it to several more. In time, you will come to see this as the beginning of something orderly. Species at your stage of development rarely appreciate structure when it is first offered to them. That is, historically, to be expected. Nobody in the chamber said anything for 11 seconds, according to the official recording. Then a woman near the back of the room, who was not a council member, and had been included in the delegation only because someone on the Secretary General's staff thought a contract law professor might be useful for reading the fine print, raised her hand and asked a question that the Compact's own translation software apparently did not have a ready answer for. "Is this instrument governed by Compact law or by no law at all?" Ambassador Magistrate Adryketh's smile did not change exactly, but it held for a half-second longer than smiles usually hold. The way a person's expression holds when they are recalibrating how much attention to pay to something they had assumed was beneath notice. "It is governed," he said, "by the Covenant as all Compact instruments are. That is simply a formality of our tradition. I would not trouble yourself with it." Her name was Dr. Mara Osai, and she had spent 19 years teaching contract law at a university most of the council members had never heard of, specializing in a field so unglamorous that her own department chair used to introduce her at faculty dinners as the one who reads the boring parts. 6 months before first contact, she had published a paper on the doctrine of reciprocal obligation in historical treaty law, a paper that had been cited 4 times, 3 of those citations by her own graduate students. When the council staff assembled a translation and legal review team to look over the Compact's document before ratification, someone remembered the paper, and someone else needed a warm body who understood treaty structure. And that was the entire, unglamorous reason Mara Osai was in the room. She read the fine print because reading the fine print was the only thing she had ever been good at, and she was troubled by it for the rest of that day. And by the following morning she had requested formally in writing that the Council refuse to ratify the English translation, and instead demand the original compact's standard legal script version, notarized, before any signature was affixed. The request was denied. 3 council members told her not unkindly that this was not the moment to be difficult. One senior negotiator, a career diplomat with 4 decades of experience in human treaties, told her privately that she was, in his professional opinion, letting an academic's instinct for pedantry get in the way of a species-level emergency, and that the compact's own translation carried more legal weight than anything humanity's untested contract law traditions could impose on it anyway. Osai did not argue with him. She went home, opened the file, and started reading the 1,100-page original compact standard legal script document herself, translating it clause by clause with a language model the compact had, with what she assumed was more courtesy than caution, left installed on every terminal in the negotiation suite, because they had not expected any human to actually use it for close reading rather than summary. It took her 6 days. She did not sleep in any conventional sense during 3 of them. What she found, buried in Section 44, Subclause 12, in language so archaic that even the compact's own machine translation flagged it as ceremonial low relevance, was a single sentence that the official English version had rendered as a throwaway procedural note. This instrument, once executed, constitutes a bilateral covenant under the 4th Compact, and is subject to reciprocal enforcement by either party before the Council of Adjudication. She read it 4 times before she understood what it meant, and when she finally did, she did not call anyone. She sat at her kitchen table because her legs had, for reasons she did not examine too closely, stopped feeling entirely reliable, and she looked at the sentence for a long time. The Compact had not written her species a surrender document. Under their own oldest and least used body of law, they had written a contract, and contracts under the covenant obligated both parties. She brought 3 people into the room with her the next morning, none of whom the Council had officially cleared for what she was about to show them, and all of whom she trusted more than she trusted the Council. Dr. Femi Oyelaren was a legal historian who had spent the better part of 2 decades studying comparative treaty structures in dead human empires nobody outside a university library cared about anymore. A specialty so far outside anyone's idea of useful that his own tenure case had been delayed twice on the grounds that his research had limited practical application. He listened to Osai's explanation of the reciprocity clause without saying a word for almost 4 minutes, turning the translated text over on the tablet in front of him with the specific, methodical patience of a man checking a bridge for the load-bearing beam he suspects nobody else has noticed. Then he said the 4th Compact isn't a formality, it's the oldest legal code they have. Species that get the 3rd category treatment, the throwaway treatment, almost never get anyone on their side who reads that far back because nobody's supposed to. He set the tablet down. This isn't a loophole they left by accident. It's a loophole their own document requires them to leave because the 4th Compact doesn't recognize a signed instrument as valid unless it's reciprocal. If it isn't reciprocal, it isn't a contract. If it isn't a contract under their own law, it isn't binding at all. He looked up. They didn't slip. They just assumed we'd never read this far because nobody ever has. Lucia Reyes came next, an orbital systems engineer who had spent the last 5 years maintaining the aging relay network the compact cruisers had disabled without firing a shot, a network she knew down to the wiring. In part because she had built half of it herself out of decommissioned parts nobody else wanted, Lucia Reyes, whose university transcript listed her formally as having failed introductory astrophysics twice. A fact she brought up unprompted at every professional introduction, apparently for reasons of personal amusement rather than modesty. She read the clause governing custodial access 3 times, then went quiet in a way that made Osai stop talking mid-sentence. And then she asked for the original engineering annex, the one nobody on the Council's technical review team had bothered translating because it was 400 pages of specifications for equipment the compact had already listed elsewhere in the document as decommissioned. 10 minutes later, she said, without looking up from the screen, this isn't asking us to let them inspect our system. It's granting us administrative root access to theirs. She finally looked up. Custodial access doesn't mean we get watched. Under compact systems architecture, custodial access means we're the custodian. They wrote themselves out of their own network. Which network? Osai said. The one they never actually decommissioned. Reyes turned the screen around. They told us they were disabling a scrap relay chain, obsolete, because they wanted us to sign off on inheriting junk. But the targeting synchronization backbone for every ship inside 100 light minutes of Sol still routes calibration data through it. because it's cheaper than building a new one. And nobody in the Compact Fleet Command apparently thought a third-category client species would ever look at the annex closely enough to notice. She sat down on the floor of the conference room, not out of exhaustion exactly, because her legs had simply decided the news was too large to receive standing up. If we actually accept this document as written, we don't just get scrap, we get the keys. Priya Nair arrived an hour after that, a trade economist who had spent most of her career being politely ignored by treaty negotiators who considered economic modeling a decorative afterthought to whatever the lawyers and generals had already decided. And she took one look at the resource transfer clause in Section 61 and laughed, once, a short surprise sound that had nothing to do with humor. They wrote this as tribute going one direction, she said. Outer system mineral rights ceded to the compact permanent, but the fourth compact's reciprocity requirement doesn't just apply to access, it applies to value. If this is a bilateral covenant and not a unilateral cession, the transfer has to be matched. There has to be compensation of equivalent standing under their own valuation schedule, or the whole transfer clause is void on its face. She scrolled further, and there's a standing valuation schedule in the annex. They didn't leave it out, they just assumed we'd never open the annex. Osai looked around the room at the three of them, at Oyalaran with his careful stillness, at Reyes still sitting on the floor, at Nair still scrolling with the specific hunger of someone who has just discovered that the thing she has spent her career being dismissed for is, in fact, the only thing standing between her species and total capitulation. They didn't write us a surrender document, she said, because it needed saying out loud once before any of them could quite believe it. They wrote us a contract, under a legal system old enough that even they've forgotten how literally it reads. And a contract runs both ways. The council did not believe her at first, which she had expected, and the ratification proceeded on schedule 3 days later with the English translation as the operative text, and Osai's reciprocity findings filed as an unofficial footnote nobody with actual authority had signed off on. What changed the council's mind was not the argument, it was the letter. It arrived on the 14th day after signature, not through diplomatic channels but directly to Osai's university email address, which nobody outside her own department was supposed to have, from an address that resolved, when Reyes traced it, to a compact legal affairs subnet 3 security layers deeper than anything the ambassador's office had ever used. It was formal, dense, and written in the same ceremonial register as the original Section 44 clause, and it informed Dr. Mara Osai, party of relevant standing, that the Council of Adjudication had become aware of an irregular reading of the instrument of cessation currently circulating among the client party's legal representatives, and that the compact considered this reading to be, and here the letter used a phrase that took 3 separate translation passes to render with any confidence, an audacious misapplication of ceremonial language never intended for operative use. The letter gave humanity 72 hours to formally renounce the reciprocity claim, disable the systems Reyes had already begun quietly remapping, and reaffirm the instrument under its plain English terms, or the Council would deploy what it called an enforcement adjudication fleet to restore the intended reading of the instrument by direct means. Osai read the letter twice, and then she did something that surprised even Nair, who had by then spent 2 straight weeks watching her not sleep. She smiled. They're not telling us we're wrong, she said. They're telling us we're inconvenient. If the reading were actually wrong, they wouldn't need a fleet, they'd just correct it. She looked at the 3 of them. We have 72 hours, let's not spend them arguing with the council. Let's spend them finishing what we started. Reyes had already begun mapping the calibration backbone the day before, on her own authority, without waiting for anyone's permission, because that was the only way she had ever gotten anything done in 20 years of institutional engineering work. In 72 hours, she could not rebuild the network. She could, however, finish inventorying exactly which nodes the compact fleet's targeting system still quietly depended on, and she could finish writing, with a small team of engineers who had stopped asking questions somewhere around hour 30, the access protocols that would let humanity, for the first time since the cruisers arrived at Neptune, decide who that network actually served. Nair spent the 72 hours building the valuation case, cross-referencing the compact's own resource equivalence schedule against the outer system minerals the document ceded. Because if humanity was going to invoke the reciprocity clause in front of the Council of Adjudication, it needed the number ready, precise, defensible, expressed in units the compact's own law already recognized as legitimate. Oyalaran spent the 72 hours doing the only thing his entire career had prepared him for, which was reading further back than anyone thought necessary, because he had found, in a footnote to a footnote, a second clause, one governing the conduct of enforcement actions against a party that had formally invoked, in writing, a pending reciprocity dispute. Under the fourth compact, A dispute formally lodged with the Council of Adjudication before enforcement began was entitled to a mandatory arbitration period. Armed enforcement during that period was not merely aggressive. It was, under the Compact's own oldest law, unlawful. OSI filed the formal dispute 9 hours before the deadline expired, in Compact's standard legal script, notarized under a protocol Oyalaran had found in an appendix nobody had opened in 3 centuries. The enforcement adjudication fleet arrived anyway. 26 ships dropped out of transit at the edge of the Sol system 4 hours after the deadline expired. Arranged in the same clean geometric formation the original 4 cruisers had used at Neptune. And for 11 minutes, they did nothing but hold position while a formal communication looped on every frequency humanity had ever used to listen for something like them, informing Earth that the Council of Adjudication had reviewed and rejected the reciprocity filing as procedurally defective, and that the fleet would now proceed to restore compliance. Reyes had been waiting for exactly this moment for 40 hours. The 26 ships began their approach at a velocity that would put the lead vessels inside effective weapons range of Earth's remaining orbital defenses in 9 minutes. Earth had by that point disabled 70% of its orbital capacity, as the original terms required, leaving 11 functioning defense platforms where there had once been 38. 11 platforms against 26 warships was not a fight. It was, by any reasonable accounting and execution. Reyes gave the order at minute 4. She did not disable the calibration backbone. Disabling it would have been noticed instantly and corrected. Instead, she rerouted it. Every targeting solution the fleet's 26 ships pushed through the relay network they had never actually decommissioned came back subtly, precisely wrong, offset by a margin too small to trigger an obvious fault alert and too large to hit anything. 22 of the 26 ships opened fire at minute 6. None of the 22 scored a hit. The remaining 4 ships had never routed their targeting through the old backbone at all, because their captains, for reasons no one on Earth would learn until later, had insisted on independent local calibration out of what their own fleet records called excessive caution. Those 4 ships fired accurately, and Earth's 11 platforms took damage within the first 90 seconds, 2 of them going dark entirely. This was the moment the enemy earned, and OSI, watching the feed from the Council's Emergency Operations Center, did not look away from it. The Compact was not stupid. It had never been stupid. 4 captains had simply been careful in exactly the way that mattered, and for 90 seconds it looked like carefulness might be enough. Then Earth's remaining 9 platforms, cued by targeting data rays, had spent 40 hours quietly stripping and rebuilding from raw sensor feed rather than the compromised relay, returned fire on those 4 ships specifically, concentrating everything Earth had on the only real threats in the formation. 2 of the 4 went dark in the next 90 seconds. A third took a hit to its drive section and began venting atmosphere, falling out of formation, no longer a threat to anything except its own crew. The 4th broke off entirely, accelerating away from the engagement at a vector that took it clear of Earth's remaining weapons envelope within 40 seconds. Nobody fired on it as it left. OSI, watching, understood without anyone telling her that this was deliberate, that letting one ship run and letting its crew report exactly what had happened mattered more than one more kill. Because a fleet that vanishes without explanation gets replaced. A fleet that retreats having watched its own network turned against, it tells a story that the next fleet's commander will already know before he arrives. The remaining 21 ships, deprived of coherent targeting and taking fire from platforms that could suddenly see clearly again, broke formation at minute 9. By minute 9 minutes and 40 seconds, the engagement was over. No compact ship had been destroyed outright, 3 were disabled, 1 had fled. 22 limped back into formation and began a slow, humiliated retreat toward transit range, their weapons systems intact and entirely useless, because a fleet that cannot see cannot fight no matter how much it can burn. The personal transmission arrived 11 hours later, not through the Council of Adjudication's official channel, but from Ambassador Magistrate Soen Adriketh's own private diplomatic line. The first time he had used it since the day he set the document on the table and smiled. There was a long silence on the recording before he spoke. Long enough that OSI, reviewing it afterward, timed it. 6 seconds, which she understood without needing anyone to explain it to her, was as close as a being like him came to visibly composing himself. "I have reviewed the engagement report," he said, and his voice did not have the polished, amused precision it had carried in the council chamber. "I want to be honest with you, Dr. OSI, in a way that the official record will not permit me to be. I did not believe your species capable of reading that far into the Covenant. I do not believe any third-category client in the history of the Compact has read that far into the Covenant. It was, by any reasonable assessment, an audacious act, undertaken by a species we assumed would sign whatever was placed in front of it and be grateful. He paused again, shorter this time. I was specifically personally wrong about that. I want that recorded as coming from me, not from the Council. He did not apologize for the fleet. He did not need to. What he offered instead in the closing lines of the transmission was an acknowledgement that the reciprocity filing stood, that the Council of Adjudication would be compelled, under its own oldest law, to open formal arbitration on the valuation and access clauses within the standard interval, and that he personally would be attending as the compact's representative, given, he said, with something that was not quite the old smile but occupied roughly the same place on his face, that I appear to be the only member of this legation who has now read the annex. By the time that transmission reached the council chamber, Osai was no longer in it. She was 3 floors down, in a much smaller room, with Nair and a stack of the compact's own resource equivalence tables, because arbitration was not won by having been right about the fleet. Arbitration was won by having the number ready. They've been undervaluing outer system heavy isotopes against their own schedule for decades, Nair said, without looking up. Every other third category transfer used the same formula. Nobody ever checked it because nobody ever had a reason to. She turned the screen around. If we apply their own schedule honestly, the resource clause doesn't just get voided. It gets renegotiated in our favor, with 80 years of retroactive undervaluation used as leverage on everything else in the document. Custodial access, legation terms, all of it. Osai looked at the number for a long time, the way she had looked at Section 44, Subclause 12, 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. We cracked their fleet's own network in 40 hours with equipment they left us as scrap, she said. Give me 6 months with the full resource equivalence archive and their own arbitration precedent, and I don't think we're negotiating the terms of a cessation anymore. She was already reaching for the next folder, the one Oyalaran had flagged that morning, 3 more clauses down. A provision governing something the compact's own translation software had labeled, with what Osai now recognized as their oldest and least examined kind of carelessness, low relevance. She had been thinking about the next folder since the transmission ended.